I'll learn you up. Yes, sir.
This is Appetite for Distortion.
Welcome to the podcast, Appetite for Distortion, episode number 386. My name is Brando. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. David Peisner. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
We have spoken before, but that was off the record. So this is kind of cool that it's on the record a bit. So if you don't know David, you probably should have, because there isn't a lot of Guns N' Roses news at all. You usually get it from either this podcast or, well, in this case, Rolling Stone. So there was a recent article that came out called The Search for a Lost GNR Masterpiece. And I'm going to sprinkle in some fan questions as we go along, because it was such an article that was not just for the diehard fans, but for the rock readers, the readers of Rolling Stone that wants a real in-depth story. And it was interesting to see and we'll talk about the reception and everything, but it read like a movie script, like a plot of a movie. And that's what it was, what it is essentially. So I guess the first thing I want to ask you, and I'll sprinkle in a fan comment. This is from Mason Frost from Alabama. Great article. It's nice to see it finally see the light of day for something we've known about for so long.
Sure.
So you and I, not quite a year ago, I think it was March of last year, we spoke for like a good hour or so about this, and you interviewed so many different people. The article about Rick Dunsford and the search for the leaks, and it's people read the article. I don't want to rehash that, but when did you stumble across this story? Because people of this listeners of this podcast know about it. But when did you find about it? Found out about it?
Sure. Well, so I actually found out about it through a friend of mine. I'm 49 years old. I grew up. I was a Guns N' Roses fan when I was younger, but I was definitely not part of this, sort of hardcore GNR community. But he kind of is. He's not like a well-known fan or anything, but kind of a somebody who's on the message boards from time to time, probably more as a lurker than a poster. But I've known him since we were kids, and I've always known that he's like a humongous Guns N' Roses fan, and we would talk every once in a while. And I can't remember if he reached out to me specifically about this, or if we were just talking, catching up, and he brought it up to me. But it was it must have been pretty shortly after like the events that are mostly described in the story. So like maybe this was like late 2019, early 2020 when I had this conversation. He told me about this story, and he kind of laid out a lot of the stuff that everyone knows. It's a mystery. It's kind of like there was a lot of really cool elements to it. And I said to him, and friends of mine will sometimes give me story ideas, and a lot of times I can see immediately why they won't work. But this one, I was like, oh, this would work. And not only would this work, I know that I'm a freelancer, and I knew if I pitched it to Rolling Stone, they'd say yes right away.
Okay.
That said, at the time, I was just loaded with other work. And so I was like, oh, this is great. I'm just going to kind of put a pin in it. And when I get through what the stuff I'm working on, I'll get around to it. And that was like probably more than a year later. Right, let's see. So maybe 2 years later. I could be my time. It was a while of kind of sitting on this idea and thinking about it. And then, but lo and behold, when I did pitch it to Rolling Stone, as I had thought, they were immediately, yes, they wanted it right away. And so that was probably early 2022 when I first started working on it. And like you said, then, we spoke, fairly shortly thereafter. And I started reaching out to everyone and all that. But yeah, it entirely came through this friend of mine.
Okay. And it sounds like it took a year to write. And what I think is the most interesting thing to me and listeners of this podcast, that we spoke about this story a couple years ago, and whenever like, because I wasn't that kind of Guns N' Roses fan either. I did go on the forums the time of Chinese democracy to learn about the leaks. It was my first time seeing Guns N' Roses in 2002. I just got really involved, but still, I wasn't one of these I don't know, ancillary characters you would find that you found in your article. That, and not until this Guns N' Roses podcast that I started, and even which I've already said, my listeners know I thought it was a silly idea at the time. Why would I want to do Guns N' Roses podcast? Because 6-7 years later, I think I know why now. But to go on my GNR forum and different forums and find out about all these characters that have been a part of this underground, this belly of Guns N' Roses fandom for so long, it was a lot of good content at the beginning of the podcast. And then I found out that it's really not good content because some people don't want you to talk about that. So people might know there are some missing episodes that I have. I've had to make them hidden under threats of lawsuits and, trying to get me fired from my job. So it was very surprising because when I would tell people the stress that I was going under, trying to explain the story to them, they think I'm crazy. So I'm in awe that you were able to successfully pitch this to Rolling Stone, because it's hard to surmise. Like you do
Sure.
obviously a
Well,
great job.
I think part of the reason why I think it was able to work, because I mean, I ran into plenty of problems, and it was a lot of digging and a lot of reporting. And I often was joking. It was like, I've never done so much like investigative reporting over something that on the surface is not that earth-shattering. I mean, we're talking about music, right? I mean, I guess Guns N' Roses music. Yes, it's like, but if we zoom out, and the kind of like investigative like journalism I felt like I was doing was hardcore to try, digging through documents and trying to track people down, and all this stuff is usually the kind of stuff you're doing when you're, whatever, like uncovering a political scandal or something.
It's Watergate, right?
Right. But
this is Leakgate.
Right. But the other thing that actually ended up being helpful, because, I did run into plenty of people who didn't want to talk.
Sure.
But there was a sort of paper trail, so to speak, of texts and, posts on forums and things like that, emails, that if you took the time and, if you tracked down like those texts and those emails and all of that stuff, you could kind of almost piece it together almost without talking to people. You could kind of see, okay, well, this person said these things on this date. And so, it just becomes a lot. It's just a lot of work, but it can be done. And, you mentioned like it took a year to write. I mean, it took a while. It took a while. It didn't quite take that long. It probably took 6 months. But then there was just, like the way these things work, you turn something in and then the magazine's figuring out when to schedule it. And there, it was kind of sitting around for a while. And then there's a lot of to do at the end of like, editing and whatnot. But
my part got cut. Well, like my part got cut.
Exactly. We talked, you and I talked, and it's interesting. I mean, I talked to a good number of people who ended up not in the story, who might have been in an earlier version, like an earlier draft that was, I mean, the way I write, like I end up writing very long first drafts that kind of is like, okay, here's everything. And then I'll go through and start figuring out, okay, I can do without doing, and you slowly whittle it down, and then editors come along and whittle it down some more. But yeah, I mean, I talked to you, and the thing is, I mean, even more than in most stories, like talking to you, talking to some other people who ended up not being quoted in the story, it was more necessary in this story for me to have those conversations than what might have been in other stories where people's contributions end up on the cutting room floor, because I needed to learn about this community. Like I needed to talk to people like you. I needed to talk to all these people to sort of get a sense, not just of the specific events that I was writing about, but also just the context of like, what is this community all about? Like I heard, tons of stories from you and other people of other really interesting like tales from this kind of community that really informed like my opinion and my and all of the other things I wrote. Wait, can you hold on?
I love that.
The cat
What's
here is,
usually there's a cat interrupting me. Actually, I'm surprised he's not. He was begging for food. I'm like, no, I gotta record. What's your buddy's name, by the way? I get distracted.
it's Indy.
Indy.
Yeah, it's Indy. But anyhow, he'll hopefully be quiet, but we'll see.
No. Hey, I said I'll ask you this at the end, like if you can interview Axl Rose. If I can interview, I can just talk cats with Axl Rose. Anyway, let's put a pin in that. Sorry, go ahead.
But yeah, but yeah. So it like I had a lot of conversations and I did a ton of research and interviews that ended up not in the story, or not specifically in the story, but they're kind of, it's in the story in a different way, and that it just kind of informed my understanding of everything.
What really told me that you got it, it was these two sentences that you really got, and especially the feature person, Rick Dunsford, who has been on the podcast. A couple of his episodes have had to be made private because of the previous mentioned threats that I got, and I'm like, I guess want to podcast and interview people. I don't need this stress. He wrote, Dunsford speaks in an often breathless southern drawl. Words stumble out in a rush, each eager to overtake the one before it. As with other aspects of his life, as excitement can get the best of him. I thought that was so brilliant. I've never met him in person. I've obviously spoken to him extensively on the phone or Zoom, but yeah, what a character he is, a lead character. What did you make of Rick when you first met him? And I guess, what do you think of him now that it's all, the dust is settled with the article?
Ricky is a really interesting guy. So yeah, when I first, as I was saying before, there were some people who were very reluctant or didn't want to speak. Rick, absolutely, from the first text I sent him, was like, I'm in, I want to talk. Like he couldn't have been more anxious. So and I went out and visited him at his home in Mississippi. And he's a nice guy. Like, there's no, like, he's a very nice guy.
Right.
But like, honestly, part of untangling the story, and I'm glad you pointed out that sentence. I was surprised that was the one that you would have picked out, but I'm really, because he does not talk in a very linear fashion where like this happened, then this happened, this happened. It's all sort of circular, and you're cutting back, and he's thinking thinking about 7 different things at once, and stories get cut off and they don't get picked up. And so, I remember the day that I was sitting with him in Mississippi, and we spoke for hours. I don't remember how long, but several hours. And then going home and going through those transcripts and trying to like make sense of it all. And then I talked to him again and again and again over the months that followed. But yeah, like in the end, he was lying. He was lying to me for months, right? So he was telling me he didn't leak the stuff. And when I sort of figured it all out and was like, okay, he definitely did this. He's been telling me, since February that he didn't. And I knew I had to have a conversation with him about it. Like, when you're reporting, like these things happen. Like I've had these kinds of conversations before. They usually are uncomfortable. They're awkward. You don't know, like it's a confrontation essentially. You're calling somebody out. Why? You've been lying to me for months. It didn't go that way at all with Rick, though. So like it was. So I sort of called him on. And I kind of laid out what I knew, and there was a couple of minutes of him kind of hemming and hawing and trying to kind of see if he could wiggle out of it. And then he just like dropped it. He was like, and he was actually complimentary of me. He was like, I can't believe you figured it out. That's so awesome. He was like excited to be able to now like talk more openly about it. And it was just such an odd reaction, but like he genuinely like he didn't have any sort of animosity towards me. he was like, he's like, I can't believe you figured it out. That's so awesome. He's like, you know more about this than me now. Like it was really, and I don't know if just the fact that it kind of made that conversation easier, which it certainly did. And I continued to talk to him afterwards, and he was continuing to be supportive of the story and still wanted the story told. I mean, I think ultimately he wanted this story to come out, and I don't know that he thought that I would get to the bottom of it or not. But I think he was perfectly willing to risk that. And I don't think I think he's perfect. I think he's happy with it. I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to, we haven't talked since the story came out, but I know he's like posted about it on social media, and he's been happy about it. So, or maybe we haven't talked on the phone. Maybe we texted. I can't remember. But anyway, but he's and so it's kind of like one of those things that, in spite of, like, I could tell you a bunch of things about him that are not flattering, like about his sort of commitment to the truth. But ultimately, I like him. Like, as a person, I like him. He's a there's certain people who are likable people, and he's a likable guy. And I tried to kind of make that point in the story. And I think MSL had said the same thing to me as well. And they've had, obviously, like a fairly, tumultuous relationship over the years. But I said that to me, like, he's a good guy. He just gets carried away. He's just, his excitement gets the best of him.
I mean, that could be said for a lot of us. Rick knows he knows you're coming on today. He was excited. He said, tell David in his interview that he should write a full book about the madness around the story and Chinese in general. So I don't know if that's in the works for the future.
It's interesting. I mean, there's definitely a lot of thoughts and some hopefully getting a little momentum about whether it's a book or another sort of some sort of project, based on this material or other stuff in this world. Because it's really like you said, you thought this is a terrible idea for a podcast, but then you start getting into it, you're like, oh my God, it's just a cast of characters, and there's
right.
just so much intrigue and yeah, it's interesting.
That's what I thought. I thought, which is what you thought, this is newsworthy. This is not newsworthy because I am one of these hyper, nerdy local Guns N' Roses fans, now, but obviously the mainstream. And you wrote it like a Guns N' Roses fan, but I appreciate where you didn't write it like a hyper nerd like me, that you have a different view of Chinese democracy. You weren't involved. You weren't following the band when they were quiet and doing nothing. I mean, who does that? Who follows a band? Unless it's the Beatles that are no longer making music, or they're done.
Right.
Who follows a band that's on like indefinite hiatus? That's just very, very strange. Something in this story, I guess, in stories, maybe in general, do you see I don't know, villain is too strong? Do you see any, is Rick, he's a nice guy, but is he a likable bad guy here?
There's a phrase that people sometimes use called a likable rogue.
Okay.
And, which is sort of what I think what you're talking about, like, and it's a pretty popular kind of I don't know, anti-hero might be a little strong, but I mean, if you think about, they're like characters you're rooting for in some way, yet like you couldn't defend their actions, and that's or you couldn't always defend them, and so and that's, I think, I don't know if Rick falls exactly into that category, but he's certainly in the neighborhood. And to be frank, so are a lot of other people in this community.
Sure.
Whatever. I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily completely different than any sort of community of people who are hardcore fans of anything. But certainly, I definitely ran into plenty of people. And, it's like, I certainly don't see there being like any heroes of this story. I think that there are a lot of kind of likable rogues who are kind of, you know, some more central to the story than others. But you know, yeah, so it is. I certainly wouldn't say Rick is an out and out villain. He definitely doesn't have sort of a. He doesn't. There's no real malice to like the things that he's doing.
That's how I feel, right? That's how I feel, and that's usually what I look toward. I told Rick when I first met him, and you put it in the article. You know, me and my wife were due in April. If 3 weeks after she gives birth, I'm like, I'm going to go on a road trip to buy Chinese democracy, you know, leftovers. We're getting a divorce. Like it's just going to happen. You know, and I wouldn't blame her. So
Right.
I said that to Rick and he understood. He only laughed. So, I mean, more power to him. I'm not naming my kid Axel. It's too on brand. I have a podcast, you know, but I know a lot of fans of this podcast name their. It's a cool name. I just can't personally do it. So it's interesting that you have that same perception because that is true of Rick. It's like didn't seem malice. So I felt that the banning is too much. What do you feel? I guess does the punishment fit the crime, and does he deserve all of it? Because he did leak some. Did he leak all of it? Did he leak some stuff? I mean, there are other people who should be banned. I feel like ban them all or ban none of them.
Right. I mean, I guess there's two ways to look at that. And one is that on a strict, you know, sort of like, did he do it? Yes, or he did certainly enough of it to warrant what, you know, or at least to back up what GNR management is sort of claiming by banning him. From a perception point of view, I don't really get it though. Like, I mean, like you're going to ban your biggest fan or one of your biggest fans because he went to all of this trouble to release a bunch of music. He didn't get rich off of this. I mean, this wasn't, you know, if he had made $150,000 and yeah, they should, you know, there'd be a whole different, but you know, like
Agreed.
at best, you know, like, and like like I said, there are things in the story that I couldn't completely nail down. There is a world where he made off with $3,000, you know,
Okay.
right, or a few grand here or there. I like, or that was like his, you know, because the band reimbursed him at one point, and he may have only paid $12,000 and they reimbursed him $15,000. This is Guns N' Roses we're talking about. They'd just come off a tour that grossed something like $500 million. You know, like to go after a diehard fan over he may have stiffed you for $3,000, and he may not have. He may have just completely broken even. But like all of that stuff, you know, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, look, they can ban whoever they want.
Sure, it's their right. I get that as a
but
business.
but I just think like it makes the band look silly and petty. And I don't know. You know, I yeah, like they got the right guy. If that was like the argument was like, oh, I mean, yes, and sure, certainly there are plenty of other people who played a part in this, can have leaked other music and who haven't gotten the same punishment. But like that's kind of like, you know, you can argue that they're not being consistent and all of that, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know that they you know, owe it to anyone to be consistent. But I do think, like I said before, I think it makes them look like petty, and it's not a good look for the band. But it's hardly the first thing they've done that's not a good look for the band.
Yes, you're absolutely right there. And speaking of the band, I guess that's the big question. And a lot of people were surprised that this wasn't like nixed. This wasn't because the band tries to shut things down. That was kind of the part of the story with the leaks. If it got out there, and rightfully so, if it leaked on YouTube or something, it was shut down. Anything spoken about that, even sometimes in certain forums, you couldn't name what the titles were. That was privy information. So how do you think Guns N' Roses feels about this article?
I
I
mean,
can, yeah,
I don't know specifically how they feel about it. I mean, like I certainly reached out to them. I reached out to their lawyers. They knew about it months and months in advance,
sure.
uh, I don't really know what they could have done to shut it down. I mean, because they were not, it's not like they helped me at all. It's not like they gave me any information. So there was no cooperation that they could cut off. I mean, yes, they could have I mean, the one thing that if they really wanted to like shut this down, they could have gone above my head to Rolling Stone and said, listen, if you cut this, if you axe this story, we'll give you an exclusive interview with Axel or something like that.
Right.
But there's two things about that. One is I don't know, like, is it worth it for the band? I mean, I don't know that the band, other than like what I was just saying about looking a bit petty, does the band come off looking any worse in this than they do anywhere else? I mean,
No.
So I don't know if I mean, not that they would have known that beforehand, but I don't know that it would have been worth it for them to make a big deal out of this. Because ultimately, to be honest, it would have just drawn more attention to the story. Especially if they made a big deal out of it and then it ran anyway, or then it, like so, and also is if that was the bait that they were dangling, which they didn't, as far as I know. I don't think they got in touch with any of the editors over my head and offered anything. The like does an interview with Axl Rose mean the same thing in 2022 or 2023 as it did in 2008 or 1997 or what any of those other times? I mean, I'd love to interview him. I think it'd be interesting, but I don't know that I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think that Rolling Stone would have never taken that bait. I don't actually know, but I mean, but again, like other than that, as long as I wasn't writing anything that wasn't true or that
slanderous,
right, about the band, then there's nothing really they could do.
Okay.
In some ways, it's interesting because it's a Guns N' Roses story, but it's not really about Guns N' Roses. It's
Right.
about the fan. It's about what people were willing to go to and are willing to endure, to get music from a band that doesn't really like to release music.
Yeah.
So, they're sort of almost just a bit part player in the story.
That's the genius of it all.
They're the thing that sets it all in motion, but
Yeah.
right. But yeah, so I mean, and in some ways, that was why when I had that conversation with my friend and he first told me about this, that I knew that Rolling Stone would want this story, because here you get to do a Guns N' Roses story, but you don't have to deal with Guns N' Roses.
like
you don't
my
have to
podcast.
deal with like whatever. I mean, I've never really dealt with Guns N' Roses on any sort of level. I mean,
Okay.
in this story, I certainly reached out to them and they weren't psyched about it. I mean, when I say that, I reached out to them and they didn't want to talk. I mean, so I say that they weren't psyched, they didn't want to talk. I don't really have any further info about what they thought about it beyond that. So it's like, I don't know that it would be a pain to deal with them, but from everything that I have gathered,
you're just dealing with it at the fan level.
About Axl. Right. I mean, so I just I imagine that it's not easy. So like here you get to do a Guns N' Roses story and you don't have to deal with any of that. Obviously, there's a lot of other things to deal with, but
there's a lot of things to deal with, and I don't want to keep you here forever, but I want to pick on a couple
Sure.
listeners that made some comments or questions. Eric just wants to give you props for naming Axl Rose as the biggest hoarder of them all. So, and Nat wants to say, if you can, I guess, what wasn't in the article that you wanted to be in there, or was there something that you wanted to include but you couldn't, maybe for time or space? Are you allowed to say that? I
mean,
kind of good.
there are certain things. There are a lot of things that I couldn't include because I didn't. There is because I didn't honestly get the reporting. There are a couple of really interesting side bits that were still side bits, but would have been really interesting. But I couldn't sort of nail down all the reporting on it. Like it was just it was close, but it wasn't there. I'm trying to think of if there were some specific things that I actually just left out, just sheerly because there was some backstory that was definitely left out because of space. But I imagine this is stuff that most of the people in the GNR community already know. That was really stuff that I felt like, oh, your average reader might not know. Stuff about earlier leaks, the stuff with Squirrel and the stuff with, which is all fascinating, but it's just kind of like backdrop to all of this. The Mike Piazza stuff, like
Right.
I mean, some of it may have ended up in there, but there was
Piazza was briefly.
right. There was a lot of backstory. Like MSL has a long backstory, which I really kind of had to kind of slim down just for space. But all of that, which again, like I think most people in the community probably know, is fascinating. And I would have and I would have loved to have had it in there. Rick himself has some other backstory that he did like concert promotion and work with some bands and things like that, and that's a whole other little alley, which again, like when you're looking at things to cut, it's a fairly obvious thing to cut. It doesn't really inform readers, but like for me, just like I thought it was really interesting.
Right.
The MSL stuff, the backstory, I think that stuff's really interesting. There's probably some more stuff about Team Brazil. Back again, just a lot of backstory that ended up, I can't remember how long the story ended up in the end, 5,000, 7,000 words, but there was definitely a version that was twice that when I first wrote it. And so, and some of that, like ended up getting cut because the reporting wasn't quite finished on it. And then some of it got cut because it was just space.
And as a wannabe writer, any specific lines like you like the way you worded something, and it's my excuse to bring this up another way that I like how you worded it. Fans would discuss a stray quote from a band member with the dedication of the Talmudic scholars. So as a Jew, I appreciate that.
Sure. I mean, and that honestly came from just like, I mean, in sort of me trying to like, I wouldn't really say embed myself, but to learn the community. Like I sat and read message boards, just like read like through like 90-page forum posts, and you just start, it just gets so granular and like and the more you read it, of course, I'm sure most people listening will know, the more you read it, the more invested you get in like the most specific details and wait, what does this mean? And that's that was really where that line came from, which was just that because then you zoom back out and you're like, wait, we're talking about the middle 8 section of this song, and somebody thinks that it's not actually Axl, it's somebody else, and like you're just like, oh my, like anyway.
I know. Yeah, take a step back from it.
And you're just
how do you feel? I'm going to ask this one. How do you feel about Chinese democracy now?
Okay, so yeah, that was interesting because like honestly, my whole experience with Chinese democracy, like personally, was I was writing a lot about music when it came out. Like I still obviously write a fair bit about music, but I just kind of do a lot of just general kind of journalism now. But at the time I was like, all through those years, like from the late 90s up through 2008 when it's coming out, I was just involved in like writing about new releases and things like that. And so the whole Chinese democracy thing, like it had slowly become a joke through that period. Like it was like, oh, it's whatever, 2002, and oh, it's going to come out. No, it doesn't. It just like, this idea that, and by 2008, it was like the joke was just so stale. Like it was like no one even makes that joke anymore because it's so stale about this is never going to come out. This is never going to come out. Oh my God, it just came out. And it was just very anticlimactic when it came out. I barely remember it coming out. I mean, I remember it, and I'm sure I listened to it once or twice and thought, and like never really, I never really dove into it. So, and I may never have listened to it again between that time and actually I did listen to it like kind of 2019, 2018 for a different thing I was thinking about. But anyway, what I started, as I was listening to it a lot around this time, I kind of started getting both. I appreciate it a lot more. I think, and I also can understand why in some ways it wasn't as successful, but also why some people have latched onto it, because there is a lot to like about it. I think it's a little overwhelming as an album.
Sure.
I think it's almost just like in a sensory way, there's too much going on. Like when you kind of think about Appetite for Destruction, okay, it's really a very raw, simple record. Like, I mean, those are great songs. It's but it's not like lavishly produced. Whereas by the time you get around to Chinese Democracy, it's almost like overload on your brain trying to like. And I what I found is that while I can individually like quite a lot of those songs, to listen to that album from beginning to end, I find kind of exhausting. And I don't know, that again, that's just my personal take on it. But also when you put that much into it, production wise, instrumentally, all of that stuff, you're good. There's a lot for people to latch onto. So the people who do latch onto it, there's plenty of stuff for them to to dig into. So I get it, and I do have a much greater appreciation of the album now than I did before I started working on the story. I don't think it's as good an album as Appetite for Destruction or Use Your Illusion 1 or 2, but I mean, in some ways, it's not. I actually have a lot of admiration for it in a strange way, even though I don't like it as much, because the thing to do if you're in any successful band is to keep doing the exact same thing over and over. That's the way you stay successful, right?
Sure.
You keep churning it out. You maybe make gradual changes here and there, right?
If it ain't broke, don't fix
Right.
it.
But what Axl was trying to do, I believe, I don't know, was not to repeat himself. Was to do something different, to try to not make another Appetite for Destruction, and you could even on Use Your Illusion, you can see that he's pushing the bounds. It's a much bigger, more ambitious album than Appetite for Destruction, although it's, again, I think it's not as good. Like there's just too much. But and then so by the time you get to Chinese Democracy, I like the fact that he's trying to do something different. I like that it's a very different album than Appetite for Destruction. That doesn't mean I like the record more. I like the fact that he tried to do this. And I would have loved to have seen him continue to try and do those things, even if it meant putting in albums that would anger the GNR fan base, would have them complaining that this doesn't sound like the GNR that I love. I mean, that's art. That's the difference between art and commerce. You
That's
can
what
be
Bowie did. Bowie did.
right.
Like Bowie's never the same.
Sure. I mean, and you can go through Bowie's catalog, and there are albums that I find unlistenable.
Sure.
But he has to do that to get to the next thing. You have to go. But the problem is, if you're Axl and you're only putting out an album every 20 years, or whatever pace
Every
he's at.
equinox or whatever.
Right. Then you're so like, it would be cool. I mean, and the other thing I would say is that if he had put out Chinese Democracy in 1999 or 2000, when it was more or less done, like, I mean, obviously things have been done since, but if he had just said, all right, it's as good as it's going to be, let's go, that would have put him on a completely different path. I think that would have been
Right.
like, okay, maybe this album, maybe it would have gotten a similar reception. Maybe people would have been kind of lukewarm to it, but it's much easier to then come back 2 or 3 years later and say, well, now I've got these new songs. Whereas you wait that long, and now everything has to be a magnum opus. And if you put that kind of pressure on yourself, it's crippling, as we've seen. So, I mean, I would have rather seen, 3 or 4 mediocre albums of like, okay, well, this is where I'm at now, this is where I'm at now, this is where I'm at now, than to have to like put all this pressure on Chinese Democracy. And who knows if there will be another album one day, in the future. But it's going to be the same thing, because now it's been just as long since Chinese Democracy as it's been since those, since the first albums. So,
but David, if he did that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You wouldn't have written that article. There would be no Rick Dunsford. There would be no MSL. There'd be no.
So there is a different way to view it, as that it's all completely genius in that,
Right.
like, how do you engender like the loyalty and like, I mean, one of the funny things that I found while working on the story was that the hardcore GNR fan base both loves and loathes Guns N' Roses. Like I've never seen a fan base with like who have the knives out so quickly for the thing that binds them together. And but in that way, right, like if you the mystery of Guns N' Roses, the mystery of Axl Rose would not be the same if he was putting out an album every 2 years. I agree. So
Well, I hope one of us gets to interview him one day.
one day.
David, thanks for spending some extra time with us. I know you're a
No
busy
problem.
dude and you're up against deadlines. People want to follow you. I know you're on Twitter, David Peisner at David Peisner. Anywhere else that people, or even any other articles coming out that you want people to see that you can talk about?
No, well, I mean, I'm on Instagram. I think it's also David Peisner on Instagram. But yeah, I mean, I'm actually working on a book right now. So I'm hoping not to have to do any stories until I finish this book. So
okay. Well, come back when you finish the book then.
I will do it.
Okay, awesome. Well, David, thank you so much, and you'll appreciate how I end my episodes. So when is the next episode you're going to see of Appetite for Distortion? In the words of Axl Rose concerning Chinese Democracy, you'll see it. I don't know if soon is the word.